G'day, humans. Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Bear with me on this one. It's terribly, terribly sad in Sydney at the moment, especially amongst Sydney's small but close-knit Jewish community. If there are any upsides to every tragedy, let's start with the positives. My 8-year-old twins got to see me cry this morning, which is maybe only the third time in their life they've. So that's seen me. So wins, little wins where you can take them. Another positive thing today: the bravest character in the horrific events of last night, the guy who tackled one of the shooters unarmed and wrestled his gun from him, and undoubtedly saved many lives. His name turns out to be Ahmed. So if you were trying to foster a spirit of civility between Jews and Muslims and make sure that we didn't caricature the Muslim community as anti-Jewish, you couldn't do better than pick a name like Ahmed, which does not exactly hide its Arabian origins under a bushel. So good news to start. The bad news, I suppose, is it certainly feels like I belong to the only ethnicity in Australia that cannot visibly congregate in public. With the exception of maybe neo-Nazis wearing swastikas, I can't think of any other community in Australia that cannot have a picnic today without fearing for their lives. And the fact that we've gotten to this situation like a frog in boiling water, how we got here and what we might do about it is something I want to hear myself work through today. It's the worst terrorist attack ever on Australian soil of any kind. It's the deadliest mass shooting in nearly 30 years since the Port Arthur massacre, which ushered in Australia's gun law reforms. Currently, as I record, 16 people are dead, 40 are injured, 29 were rushed to hospital at the time of the shooting, which occurred a little after 6:45 p.m. on Sunday evening at Bondi Beach. 2 gunmen opened fire onto a crowd at a Hannukah event. The youngest person killed is a 10-year-old girl who died in hospital. She was one of the 29 rushed to hospital. 2 of those were police officers who were wounded in the shootout. The oldest person slain is an 87-year-old man. It was a big family event. Everyone from all over the various diverse Jewish communities in Sydney, hundreds of people. And this pair of gunmen swaggered around. You can see video of their kind of careless insouciance as they just wander around, picking people off. I encourage you not to try to find those videos anyway. Apparently the person who's in custody as one of the suspects is a 24-year-old Pakistani-Australian gentleman, apparently born here, and his co-assailant, was his own father, who's a 50-year-old bloke. Apparently, Australia's domestic spy agency, ASIO, looked into the younger of these alleged shooters 6 years ago for possible ties to ISIS. Apparently, this isn't confirmed by the authorities, but reputable news organizations have it on background from the intelligence services and from the Joint Counterterrorism team that the shooter had an ISIS flag in his vehicle, which also contained improvised explosives, which the bomb squad was working on by the time I went to bed last night. It's worth noting also, for a bit of context, what Bondi Beach means in the kind of iconography of Australia, in the national imagination. I wrote a piece for an American outlet last night. I needed to hear myself work through it a little bit. And the way I put it was this, which is probably better than I can do by ad-libbing. Bondi Beach is a long, wide arc of shimmering golden sand facing the rolling waves of the South Pacific. It isn't just an Australian icon. as the most centrally located beach in the country's biggest city, it's endlessly active, a constant hive of cultural events, film festivals, food fairs, concerts, and social gatherings, as well as the bronzed Aussie bodies splashing and surfing and sunning and strolling in Speedos and flip-flops, which we confusingly call thongs. Don't ask. Americans, don't ask. Bondi Beach boasts a Ferris wheel and an arts pavilion and a promenade and a grassy park between the road and the sand. That park tonight was a bloodbath, I wrote. Hannukah by the Sea is a special night for Sydney's Jewish community. There are petting zoos, face painting, food stalls. Children light candles to usher in the holidays because it was the first evening of Hannukah. It's summer in Australia, so the air is warm, the beach is packed, and Jewish families were gathered near the children's playground when bullets tore through their flesh. As the massacre unfolded and my spouse and I, safe at home, desperately texted friends, my 8-year-old daughter overheard us. "What happened in Bondi, Daddy?" she asked. She knows the area very well, needless to say. I said some bad guys hurt people, but they've been stopped and it's safe now. And when I went to bed, I found myself thinking, well, is it safe now? Just because these shooters are no longer there? The father was killed by police in the shootout. What does it mean to be safe now in this world? Not just for Jewish people, but for everybody, anywhere. There are going to be a lot of hot takes in these next few days, especially in the Australian media. There will be pro-Israeli Jews who blame critics of Israel for encouraging criticism of the Jewish state. There will be anti-Israel activists who will blame Israel for putting a target on Jews' backs. Conservatives, I'm sure, will blame the Prime Minister and the federal government for allowing anti-Jewish sentiment to flourish. Lefties will blame conservatives for suppressing legitimate criticism of a foreign state and thereby fostering a climate of antagonism. Some people are already saying that we must make sure in our postmortems that we don't scapegoat Muslims or collectively blame pro-Palestinians. Others will say that the attack proves that Israel is not to blame for anti-Semitism because it's the world's oldest hatred and this could have happened anywhere at any time, Gaza war or no Gaza war, Netanyahu or no Netanyahu. And everyone will agree that we all just have to say no to hate. Say no to extremism and hate. It is tiresome to me, these conversations. It feels like the chatter of a bunch of tribes trying to reflexively reinforce their own worldviews and rationalize why they're not complicit in creating the culture that has led to this, when we're all complicit because we live here and it happened. Multiple things can be true. It can be true that Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians, its occupation of the West Bank and the construction of Israeli towns there and the blockade of Gaza and the ferocity of the Gaza war obviously increased anti-Jewish sentiment around the world. It can also be true that hating Jews has been a popular pastime like everywhere for centuries, and it didn't need the impetus of Israeli settlements in the West Bank to kick it off. It can also be true that Jews who criticize Israel are doing something valuable in demonstrating that the Jewish community is not homogenous, that it's diverse and quarrelsome internally. And it can also be true that those arguments would never have swayed the kind of violent ideologue who probably pulled off an attack like this. It can be true that Jews who defend Israel did not deserve to get shot at the beach for that crime. Australia last year appointed a special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Gillian Segal, a very competent and well-respected woman. And she released a report in July of this year with a bunch of recommendations about dealing with anti-Semitism, because this is not a brand new thing. She released a statement today about what happened last night, which I'll quote from. She says, "This did not come without warning. In Australia, it began on the 9th of October, 2023, at the Sydney Opera House. We then watched a march across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, waving terrorist flags and glorifying extremist leaders. Now death has reached Bondi Beach. These are Australian icons. Targeting them is deliberate," she writes. "This isn't random. It's an attack on Australia. To ordinary Australians," she says, "this moment demands clarity. What once seemed distant or uncomfortable can no longer be ignored. Taunts from the Opera House steps, synagogues set alight, and now massacres at a celebration form a clear pattern. This is not the Australia we know, and it cannot be the Australia we accept," she writes. Benjamin Netanyahu wrote to the Prime Minister overnight saying a similar thing, that he has failed in keeping Jewish Australians safe. I don't know. I just don't know. If it is true that this horrendous terrorist attack was pulled off by people who are ideologically sympathetic to ISIS years ago, regardless of whether it's these people who, this gentleman who's currently in custody, we don't know, he's innocent until proven guilty, but assuming that this is the worldview of whoever did it, did such a person require a march across the Harbour Bridge and protests being tolerated at the Opera House in order to do this? Do we know that the attack would have happened in such a visible way at such an iconic location if the broader society had not been so enthusiastic about celebrating those provocations at the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge? It's possible. It's possible that the climate createth the man. I'm not thoroughly convinced. They interviewed this suspect's mother as police swarmed her home in the west of Sydney. And she's quoted in the Sydney Morning Herald. The reporter interviewed her. She said, quote, "Anyone would wish to have a son like my son. He's a good boy. He goes to work, he comes home, he goes to exercise, and that's it. He doesn't even go out. He doesn't mix around with friends. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke." I like that that's the measure of a good person. I'm not sure many ISIS fighters were big drinkers or smokers. The Prophet frowns on it, peace be upon him, so I'm not sure that's a get-out-of-jail-free card when it comes to whether you're a great guy. It's also worth noting for context when I'm describing what Bondi is like, what the Australian Jewish community is like, because I don't think you can understand the psychological impact of this unless you understand that. It's a small community. There aren't very many Jewish people in Australia. And I only learned this earlier this year when I interviewed Charlotte Kerchak, who is an American Jewish educator, very pro-Israeli. And I had her on the show, and she revealed to me that she had learned that Australia's Jewish community is the most heavily descended from Holocaust survivors of any Jewish community in the world, apparently. which when you think about it, it makes a certain amount of sense. After the war, there was a huge influx of refugees. My father and his mother and family were, part of that influx in the early 50s. And after that, once Jews could go to America and Canada and Europe, they weren't exactly looking to go to the other side of the world to a place with barbecues and beaches. Not such a Jewish style, really. So Australia just is not, a significant draw card for the Jews of the globe since they were desperate in the post-war period, which means that Australian Jews are uniquely descended from people who endured the Holocaust, as my grandmother did. Indeed, my dad, he was born in a refugee camp in 1943 in Switzerland during the war. So there's a certain rawness and sense of vulnerability that may exist amongst the Australian Jewish community that may not be present elsewhere to the same degree. I'm not a big believer in intergenerational trauma, or the idea that you can literally experience the traumas of your forebears in your bones. But it obviously matters if a very proximate relative has been hunted merely for their religion or ethnicity, and if they endured the darkest and most astonishingly threatening overtures against humans that mankind has ever concocted. It probably does give you an additional sense of vulnerability and an additional sense of gratitude to be in a place like Australia, which thus far at least has been somewhat immune. Let's just hear from the 2GB radio reporter Will Bottom, who was on Ben Fordham's radio show this morning, and he was at the scene last night describing some of the injuries in the 40-odd people who were injured and 16-ish people who died, and what that looked like. This is Will.
Was initially 12 dead and 29 injured. That's coming through to me that we now have 16 people dead, and the number of people injured has increased to 42. So I was going through some of these numbers early this morning. We had a 62-year-old woman that was shot in the upper thigh, 45-year-old man shot in the head, 21-year-old man shot in the shoulder, a 44-year-old man shot shoulder and arm, 14-year-old girl shot in the backside, 24-year-old man shot in the back area, approximately a 60-year-old man was shot in the head. I believe that he'll be one of the ones who would have added to the death toll overnight. These ages, I can't run through them all, but we've got people 86, 39, 35, 22, 50, 72. Just really, really tragic. I was here probably within 15 minutes of when it happened last night, and this small little patch of grass, this reserve, was just covered. There would have been 100 people there, and for as many people laying down, there would have been 6 or 7 people attending to each one. That was police, paramedics obviously, but lifeguards that had stepped in to help, and just members of the public that had done their best as well. And I was speaking to someone early this morning with connections to Bondi lifeguards. They told me that they called for the shark alarm to be sounded when they realised that there was around 25 people that had been shot. They called for the shark alarm to be sounded and the beach to be evacuated, and that was certainly the case when I got here, with just 2 police boats out in the middle of the water, and scenes that, normally Bondi Beach, where all our tourists come and go and visit the busy Bondi Beach, it was all the water and the sand just empty, and onlookers just shocked and in tears with what they'd witnessed.
That's Will Bottom on 2GB Radio on Ben Fordham's show this morning, painting a picture of the scene. So how did it happen and how did we get here? There will be lots of talk about gun law reform, about the fact that supposedly the father who was killed in the attack by police had multiple firearms and had a firearm license. There will be talk about immigration and what can be looked at in terms of the radicalization of people who come to Australia. And I suppose before we get into those conversations, it's worth going back to the Special Envoy's plan to combat anti-Semitism, because she says that the plan that she released in July has not been activated. It has been read and equivocated on and become a political football. But she actually had some quite specific recommendations that were not just, oh, well, what can we do? It's a free country. Stuff like this will sometimes happen. One of her recommendations, 3.5, was about security, law enforcement, and coordination. And she writes this: it's intolerable and unacceptable that one segment of our community should need to wrap its schools, community centres, and places of worship in multiple layers of physical security to protect itself from genuine threats. So her recommendations, her key actions there are that the envoy will monitor the Jewish community's increased needs post 7th of October in terms of physical security at existing and new Jewish institutions, and have government continue to provide funding support for ongoing and increased operational security needs. The envoy will advocate to continue to have the appropriate authorities investigate sources of overseas funding entering public institutions, including universities, which might drive extreme ideologies. And lastly, the envoy will advocate to state and federal governments to consider a permanent standing cooperation arrangement to investigate incidents and threats, as well as links to terrorist elements, meaning that the states and the federal government should speak to each other in a more direct way about those threats, about sharing information. Australia is a federation, much like the United States, so our police are employed by the state government, and then the federal police by the federal government, the equivalent of the FBI, and communication is not always as ideal as it could be between the two. The envoy to combat anti-Semitism also writes in a section on culture, arts, and public broadcasting: Jewish Australians have historically been highly active in Australian cultural life. Unfortunately, in recent times, there have been many examples of the active and deliberate exclusion of Jewish artists, performers, and creatives. Such conduct must be strongly rejected and countered. And in the section on migration and citizenship, she says, the objective is to review immigration and citizenship policies to ensure that Australia screens applicants for extremist views, including anti-Semitic views, and engages internationally to combat anti-Semitism. Migration policies must guard against the importation of hate. Visa applicants should be screened for anti-Semitic views or affiliations. Non-citizens involved in anti-Semitism should face visa cancellation and removal from Australia. Australia should also collaborate with international partners to share intelligence and fight anti-Semitism across borders. And the key actions there on migration and citizenship are to screen visa applicants for anti-Semitic views or affiliations, consistent with a risk-based approach, ensure the Migration Act effectively facilitates visa refusals or cancellations for anti-Semitic conduct and rhetoric, and provide anti-Semitism training to staff within the Department of Home Affairs and everyone involved in processing visa applications. Now, obviously, none of these things apply in the case of a person who was born here and then radicalized into ISIS, if that is, in fact, the situation of the person who actually committed this crime. We don't know. So this is more about the broader climate in which Jews have felt in the past couple of years in Australia, like there's a selective level of outrage and exclusion towards them that other communities don't face. And I've got to say, whether or not the existence of a climate of broadly tolerated anti-Jewish sentiment contributes to the reality of an on-the-ground massacre, it is in itself an undesirable state of affairs. Obviously, criticizing Israeli war crimes is legitimate. But many Jews have felt that singling out the Jewish state for a unique level of opprobrium that we don't apply to Yemenis or Saudis or Chinese or Iranian Australians just smelled a bit off. Smelled like it could be creating a culture of permissibility around demonizing one community in a way that we would be deeply uneasy about doing to any other. Even just tiny little things like there was a panel conversation on a podcast from one of the big centre-left news outlets talking about the problem of anti-Semitism in Australia, and they had 3 people talking about it, none of whom was Jewish. Not a big deal. But can you imagine a panel from a centre-left media organisation discussing the problem of racism against First Nations Australians without a single First Nations person on the panel? Can you imagine a panel about LGBTQIA plus hate crimes without a single queer person on the panel? It just wouldn't happen. Every day in 1,000 ways, Jewish Australians have felt that fundamentally Jews don't count as a group, as a minority. There's something suspect about them. There's something a little bit off. And of course, I've been wrestling with this for more than 2 years. Many Jewish Australians will be listening to me and will be thinking, if they would find it too impolite to say it, they'll be thinking, well, you've got blood on your hands, Josh. You've been critical of Israel. You've broken ranks. You haven't had Israel's back when the Jewish community felt like you should have. And all I can say to that is that many things can be true. It's blindingly obvious to me that it endangers Jews all over the world to create a perception that we are in lockstep with the Israeli Defense Forces. Because legitimate criticisms can be made of the Israeli Defense Forces and of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and its treatment of Palestinians and its war in Gaza. And I regret the wording of the most prominent article in which I made the case for Jews around the world to distance themselves from Israel, both for moral reasons and for strategic reasons. I sort of ended it with a flourish that said, it's time for Jews to abandon Israel, assuming that people who read the previous 1,149 words of the article would understand that what I was talking about was that diaspora Jews should abandon the instinct to defend Israel at all cost. That we have to, I spoke at length, paragraph after paragraph, about the need for Jews around the world to find a vision of Jewishness that does not involve them constantly making excuses for Israeli policies. But, whenever you're writing anything, you're sort of in a struggle between, am I going to write something that is perfectly nuanced and could not be misunderstood by adding in so many qualifiers that it becomes denuded of all of its character, but is safe? Or am I going to go for the thing that makes people fall off their chair because it's powerful, even if it risks being misunderstood? And I made a mistake in going for the latter because many people who then only read the headline thought that I was saying that Jews in Israel should abandon the Holy Land and the country should be dissolved and Palestinians should overrun it and have more of a right to Israel than Israelis do. Not what I was saying. It wasn't an anti-Zionist case in the sense of being opposed to the existence of a state for Jews within the 1967 borders. It was a plea for Jews around the world to be more creative about the way they think about their Jewishness than in simply engaging constantly in reflexive defenses of practices that, if we were honest with ourselves, we would find morally inexcusable, even before October 7th. So I get that there's pain, and I get that there's hurt, and I get that there are feelings of betrayal on all sides. And I cop it from both sides, because people who are really pro-Palestinian think that my Zionism puts me beyond the pale, and people who are really pro-Israeli think that my criticism of Israel puts me beyond the pale. I do think it's important to note a couple of things. It would be incredibly unfair to blame pro-Palestinian activists on Instagram for fermenting a climate of Jew hatred by relentlessly pumping out anti-Zionist rhetoric and one-sided depictions of the crimes of Israel against Gazans without the context of the 500 million odd people surrounding Israel who were quite okay with the possibility of erasing all of the Jews out of the Middle East on the numerous occasions that they invaded them. And without criticizing Palestinian leadership and the gullibility of international institutions for being on board with the claim that what Palestinians really deserve is a state all the way from the river to the sea. Because what that means to Jews is no more state, no more homeland, no more safe haven. It might sound weird to outsiders to think that Israelis would cling so much to such a shitty and hostile part of the world. The Onion once had a headline from a pretend article from like 1948 saying that the founding Israeli prime minister announced, "At last our people will have freedom and peace as we set up our state between Jordan, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt." Darkly funny. And I'd always thought that actually there's not really a problem with Jews being just a diaspora people. They don't necessarily have to have a state. Well, if October 7th hadn't changed my feeling about that, or rather the international reaction to October 7th, the disproportionate focus on the illegitimacy of the founding of the Israeli state versus all other states that were also founded in bloodshed, then last night certainly made me feel that this is a funny little tiny group of people who definitely need to be running their own affairs somewhere and to not put their existence in the generous good graces of the people who allowed yesterday's atrocities to take place. Criticizing Israeli war crimes is legitimate. And I can imagine that a lot of people who have been on the anti-Israel side of things over the past couple of years will feel singled out and unfairly blamed for the actions of what is probably a couple of fanatical psychopaths, whether or not it's the people who are the person who is in custody. Again, he deserves a trial on the presumption of innocence. But it's a bit of a dodge. It's a bit of a dodge to say, we have nothing to do with that level of extremism. Therefore, the worldview that we've spent the past couple of years promulgating and moving into the mainstream has not been corrosive. You're not just criticizing Israel when you dress up like Hamas, which some protesters have done. That's not criticism of Israel. To dress up like a theocratic, jihadist, death cultist. It's not criticism of Israel to chant from the river to the sea. From the river to the sea means to Jews that all of the people, all of the Arabs who lived in what Israel now is within the 1967 borders, the legitimate nation state of Israel, that they should all live there. Well, they would then outnumber Jews, if not already, then very quickly, because they have more kids. So then there is no Jewish state. What happens to the subways? What happens to the infrastructure? What happens to the companies when there is no longer the state that we've had since the 40s and is now a new Arab state? How great, how well run, how uncorrupt is this Arab government going to be? Is it going to be like the government of Lebanon or more like the government of Yemen? Which Arab country do we think is the model for what a really great Palestine should look like if it were run from the river to the sea? How protected will Jews be when you look at the way that Jews are treated in Arab and Muslim countries? What is the Arab Muslim country that the pro-Palestinian who chants from the river to the sea wants to model the treatment of Jews off? Can you understand how, to a Jewish person, from the river to the sea means we want to get rid of the state that is currently your safe harbour and create a state, yet another Arab Muslim state of the many, many, many Arab Muslim states in that region. Yet another one, and you will have to submit your security and your children's future to trusting in the political processes of that newly formed Arab state if you're not literally driven away, slaughtered, put on trains or planes or whatever, the way that most people in the Arab world, including in Palestine, want you to be. Best case scenario, they take it over, allow you to stay, and then treat you how exactly? Where is the bastion of liberalism, of pro-gay sentiment, pro-Jewish sentiment, pro-feminist sentiment in the Arab Muslim world that you envisage in this state that runs from the river to the sea across all of Israel? So when you say, we're allowed to have legitimate criticisms of a foreign country, it doesn't mean that we have blood on our hands. It's true, you don't. But you're creating a climate in which one particular ethnic group here in Australia is effectively being collectively blamed for the actions of a foreign country that they may or may not support. And the reason they're being collectively blamed is because your rhetoric is not targeted at the misdeeds of that country. It's targeted at the existence of that country, and it advocates for the annihilation of its people who are explicitly the same people as the community that feels besieged right here. Chanting from the river to the sea is not anti-Israel. It is not a criticism of Israel. It lands as genocidal. Graffitiing "Globalize the Intifada" is not a criticism of the Israeli state, of Israel's policies. Protesting outside places of worship is not a criticism of Israeli policies. It is a direct attempt to make one community feel unsafe. Over the past 2 years, Jewish school children in Australia have had to take off their yarmulkes, hide their school uniforms. All over. This is not an isolated thing. This is a frequent occurrence. Talk to any Jewish family about how they feel, how unsafe they feel when they're out and about if they're visibly Jewish. And after yesterday, I can honestly say I belong to the only ethnicity in this country which can no longer visibly congregate in public. That has never happened in my lifetime to any community. So yes, if you've relentlessly been focused on the crimes of one state, while you ignore the crimes of all the others, and if you've conflated those crimes with the illegitimacy of that country in its very founding, used them to say not what I said, which is that Israel's behavior over the past couple of decades has become so extreme that diaspora Jews should stop defending it, but something very different, which is that the founding of Israel was, because it was based on dispossession, illegitimate. Name me a country whose founding did not involve bloodshed and dispossession. All of them. So Jews feel that if you've been spending the past couple of years pumping out Instagram videos about From the River to the Sea and Globalize the Intifada and how Zionists just love the blood of Palestinian babies and it's illegitimate and fuck Israel, it's a bit fishy. It's a bit selective. Every country has done shitty things. It's totally legitimate to criticize what Israel has become under Benjamin Netanyahu. But it is anti-Semitic to question whether or not one group gets the right to found a country in the flames of revolution, dispossession, and maybe even genocide. And that's the only ethnic group in the world that doesn't get to do so. That's what anti-Zionism is. So when Jewish Australians feel afraid every time their kids go and wait at a bus stop in case they get mown down by a drive-by shooter. When I go to my father's funeral at a synagogue and have to wait in a security line behind bollards so that some maniac can't drive a truck bomb or bring in a gun to shoot up innocents, just sit with the fact that that's the reality that we've regarded as being okay. As the Special Envoy's plan to combat anti-Semitism said, it is intolerable and unacceptable that one segment of our community should need to wrap its schools, community centres and places of worship in multiple layers of physical security to protect itself from genuine threats. It's a totally one-sided situation. If you're not Jewish, I don't blame you for not seeing it. But understand how conflicted it is to be in a position where you disagree strongly with the policies of a foreign state that claims to act on your behalf, but so much criticism of that foreign state is coming from algorithms that only want to shock, the social media strategies and tactics of jihadists who have gotten pretty good at selectively identifying which clips are going to go most viral. They learned it well during the whole ISIS uprising. I mean, do you remember the American pilots being dressed in orange jumpsuits, locked in cages in the desert and set on fire? Do you remember Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was beheaded live on video? They got good at this. And I'm not being sloppy by using a generic they to mean like, oh, all Muslims or all Arabs or something. I'm talking specifically about the organizations that are affiliated with Hamas. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Qataris, and leftover members of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. These are not dummies. They know how to play the game of global sympathy. They know how to launder themselves through international institutions. I mean, Iran bribed South Africa to, I was going to say whore itself out, that might be somewhat impolite, but to spend its apartheid credibility by being the country that would bring Israel to the International Court of Justice on charges of apartheid and genocide. That was Iran that persuaded South Africa to do that. They didn't just wake up one day and decide that they were going to do it. China owns TikTok. It's in their interests to have Western civilization as divided as possible on contentious issues like Israel. I'm not saying that that means that they boost anti-Israel content even when it would be more profitable not to do so. I'm saying, although they may, I'm saying that what is certain is that there's no incentive in the Chinese Communist Party to address the problem of inflaming Jew hatred on the platform. Everyone in Gaza who's able to get videos out of Gaza has obviously been at risk of being dragged through the streets behind a pickup truck or shot in the head if the videos that they were disseminating out of Gaza displeased Hamas. So I'm not saying that videos out of Hamas and images out of Hamas are fabricated. I'm sure they're not. They may lack a little context. They may generally skew towards Hamas's view of things and not Israel's. When Jewish people abroad are attacked by Arabs or Muslims, Arabs or Muslims in Australia do not generally feel threatened by Jewish Australians. Jewish Australians generally do not respond by intimidating Arab Australians, intimidating Muslim Australians. How many mosques have the kind of security that Australia's synagogues do? How many Muslim school students are afraid of being mown down by a fanatical Zionist in a drive-by shooting? At a synagogue event that I went to shortly after my father's burial earlier this year, the rabbi was practicing a loving kindness kind of prayer. And he encouraged everybody to think about increasing concentric circles of care and well-wishers. It was where you send out positive prayers to the world. And he started with the Jewish community, and then Australians, and then people all over the world. And then he specifically called out Gazans and Palestinians. And he said to the congregation of gathered Jewish Australians, if it's too soon for you to go there, I get it. But I encourage each and every one of you to get there, to a place where you're sending your love, your warmth, your well wishes, your faith, your peace to everyone in Gaza, to Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians who are hurting. And I found it touching and mature. And as I left the synagogue, I couldn't help wondering, how many mosques in Australia have imams who encourage their congregants to send out love and peace to Jews? It's an honest question because I don't know the answer to it. It might be lots of them. My point is simply that there's an asymmetry here in the experience of the Jewish community. And yesterday feels like a kind of devastating capstone to it. That everyday Jews and prominent Jews have been shouting from the rooftops for some time, as evidenced by the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism's report, that there is more that can be done in very practical ways to address the soup in which we're all swimming, which is tolerating a latent level of, if not Jew hatred, certainly Jew distaste. Now again, what the hell does that have to do with maniacs who may or may not be total religious basket cases mowing down families? It's unclear. But we can't be certain that it has nothing to do with it. David Fromm, who has been a guest on this podcast more than once, former George W. Bush speechwriter, now at The Atlantic, a good journalist and thinker, considerably more conservative than myself, an anti-Trump, old-school conservative, writes in The Atlantic a piece overnight about the Sydney attack. He says, after the mass killing in Sydney, facing reality is not merely urgent, it's inescapable. Symbolic violence, he says, is a rehearsal for actual violence. Many in the Western world have interpreted post-October 7th anti-Israel actions within the framework of free speech. 10 days after the terror attacks, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education posted a statement. This is a libertarian free speech organization in the States, which does great work. But Fromm quotes them critically. They wrote, "Let every participant in the debate over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict show their cards, even those with the most extreme views, and let others marshal arguments and evidence to refute or discredit those views." You may note that that's pretty similar to something you hear me say on this podcast a lot. I do tend to be on the free speech end of the spectrum. After October 7th, when people were being cancelled for being too insensitive about their comments, whether they're pro-Palestinian comments, I actively argued, vocally argued, in defense of people's right to walk right up to the line of Jew hatred. Even some of the worst figures on Instagram, I grudgingly exhorted the traumatized Jewish community not to cancel those people, not to try to work behind the scenes, to get their publishers to sever relationships with them, to get their podcast networks to stop hosting their podcasts, to get their managers and agents to fire them as clients. I never thought that was the right way of doing things. I removed myself from a WhatsApp group of Jewish creatives, which was subsequently doxed anyway, precisely because the conversation had gotten too hysterical about how can we prevent this person from saying these things. And I always felt like arguing with the ideas was better than punishing the human being. But am I naive? Is this just not the way the world works anymore? David Frum goes on to write in The Atlantic, "But what if the extreme view in question," he says, "is that Jews should be made to fear death?" He quotes a prominent anti-Israel academic, Steve Salaita, who wrote an essay in 2021. This is the anti-Israel side, right? And Steve wrote, "Speak of rights and democracy and civil liberties." And then, he was rejecting people who speak of rights and democracy and civil liberties and then superimpose those categories onto Palestine. Steve, writing in defense of Palestine, said, "It doesn't occur to them that Palestine has its own vocabularies of freedom worth forcing into the American conversation." So David Frum says, okay, well, it's helpful to possess a lexicon of what's typically intended by these vocabularies that this pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli academic wants to insert into the American/Western conversation. David Frum writes, "Armed struggle means shooting people or blowing them up with bombs. By any means necessary," which is a line that you hear from pro-Palestinian activists or anti-Zionist activists. "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free by any means necessary." Frum writes, "By any means necessary means targeting the most defenseless, children, the elderly, other civilians. Globalize the Intifada means shooting or bombing people in Sydney, London, Paris, Toronto, Los Angeles, and New York City, as well as in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. From the river to the sea," he writes, "means the annihilation of a sovereign democratic state and the mass murder, expulsion, and enslavement of much of its population." Now, many of you will dispute that, so that's not what people mean when they say from the river to the sea. To which I would say, one of the great lessons that the social justice reckoning of the past decade taught us was that it's not really cool for the person who is being demeaning and offensive from a position of power to deny the impact that their words and descriptions are having on the person who claims that they are insulting or bigoted. We sort of ruled that out in every other case. You're not allowed to say, "Oh, no, I wasn't being racist. You're just taking it, you're being hypersensitive." No, basically, if many reasonable people of color are telling you that you're being racist as a white person, shut up and listen to them. You don't get to go into the office and slap a woman on the ass and call her toots and say, "I wasn't being sexist." You're just taking it the wrong way. No, if women decide that that's sexist, you go, all right, well, we can't do that anymore. Isn't this like a catechism of the left? Isn't this social justice 101? Listen to the impact that your words and behavior have on the people who claim that it's inappropriate. That's the rule for everyone else. But again, Jews don't count. They don't count in that metric. When Jews say, "From the river to the sea," sounds like you want us either to die or leave or suffer under an Arab regime, all the other of which are incredibly hostile to Jews. The people who say "from the river to the sea" get to say, no, stop being so sensitive. You're being silly. They would never say it to another minority. That's what anti-Semitism looks like in the 21st century. Everyone knows that it has become too taboo to say the quiet part out loud, to say that there is something fishy about the Jewish people. Only Nick Fuentes says it, and when Tucker Carlson platforms him, the whole world goes batshit crazy. That taboo is probably breaking down, but among polite society, it still very much exists. So of course anti-Semitism doesn't come out in the form of there's something suspect about the Jews, I never trusted them, and they probably have it coming anyway. Similarly, I'm sympathetic to critics of Israel who feel that Jewish or Israeli people who want to defend every bad thing that Israel does can use the anti-Semitism card to demean their critics and imply that you're not allowed to make legitimate criticisms of the state of Israel because if you do, then you're being an anti-Semite. That's also a bullshit move. But within the context of understanding how a community is dealing with a crisis in which they're torn in several different directions and feel besieged and alienated by their fellow countrymen who don't belong to their ethnicity, it's bloody important to listen to how they talk about an issue, about how they receive what you're saying, about the long-standing coded ways of talking about Jews that you are accidentally re-articulating, which get heard. Talk about Jews being bloodthirsty. Sorry, Zionists. You can, again, it's too taboo to talk about Jews, so you talk about Zionists, even when you're not talking about Zionists. You're saying that the people who are stripping Palestinians of their dignity and their national self-determination love the blood of Arab babies. That is an ancient slur, many centuries old. It keeps coming up again. I don't think you know why you're saying it. I don't know where you get it from, but it's something that's in the ether. It has been in the ether of the distaste for Jews, along with the claim that they are powerful puppet masters. This is why it's so self-defeating when pro-Israeli groups do behave as powerful puppet masters and try to get people fired from media organizations or shamed or something behind the scenes by pulling strings. It's terrible because when it comes out, it just reconfirms the most tawdry and predictable cliche that anti-Semites peddle, which is that the world is secretly controlled by a cabal of Jews who arrange things according to their desires, who never have a true allegiance to their home country because their allegiance is always suspect. This is another point that Nick Fuentes makes. I mean, it's so old, it's like even boring to recount, but the idea that a Jew's affinity will always be to fellow Jews and also to the state of Israel. It will never be to the home country. So they're a kind of an alien force, a parasitic force that exists inside societies. These are ideas that float around that are very, very deeply widespread and ingrained, especially in the Arab and Muslim world. And they find their ways into our algorithms. They find their ways into our conversations. They find their ways into our framing of things. They find their ways into the ways that international institutions like the United Nations look at the Israel-Palestinian conflict with never a second glance at Palestinian intransigence, at Palestinian maximalism, at the constant desires to have a state that runs all the way from the river to the sea, at constant rebuffs of Israeli overtures for peace, at constant blowing up of buses and intifadas and so on, and always lays not 50% of the blame, but 90% of the blame or 100% of the blame at the feet of the Jewish state. These inconsistencies Jewish people notice. And they see them as the most recent re-articulations of old stories about the Jews. I mean, one reason why I've felt that it's important for me as a reasonably prominent Australian Jewish person to criticize Israel publicly is precisely to undermine one of the big pillars that anti-Semites rest their case against the Jews on, which is that our allegiance will always be to a foreign country, not to Australia. My allegiance is to Australia. My allegiance is to morality. My allegiance is to the truth. And my allegiance is to the Jewish people as well, who I think would be better served by following my example and being a more complicated, rambunctious, dissonant, quarrelsome, difficult to pin down, difficult to define, harder to hate inside a single box minority that clearly is not marching in lockstep with a foreign power. But there's a deeper thing going on in all this, which worries me much more than the ambient climate of Jew hatred. And that is the tendency of all of us in culture at the moment to think that it's a bit passé to embrace the universalist, colorblind vision of a future that Martin Luther King articulated, that Gandhi articulated, that Nelson Mandela articulated, that probably most recently Barack Obama articulated, that is now regarded as naive. This idea that we should judge individuals on the basis of the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Oh, we will always have racism, and we will always have dysfunction in particular communities, and we will always have problems, and society is really a tale of quarrelsome communities vying for power. Identitarianism is the common thread through Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and also Black Lives Matter and the most extreme versions of First Nations pride. Multiculturalism is a tricky thing to get right and to sustain. Australia is one of the best countries in the world at it. More than half the population of Australia has arrived since the Second World War. We're extremely diverse. And we luckily do not suffer two things that multicultural European countries seem to. The first is a certain level of insularity and dysfunction amongst migrant communities that face intractable economic challenges and become increasingly rather than decreasingly radicalized over time. Think of the outskirts of Paris, big suburbs, or also in northern England, where you've got entire towns that have essentially have no native-born people in them and suffer from feeling like they're forgotten, like there's no opportunity. And they express their frustrations in dysfunctional ways. Often local police forces have to take a hands-off approach and basically leave law enforcement up to local community leaders. Sometimes you'll have sort of essentially local Pakistani mafia elders enforcing the behavior of 14-year-old Pakistani British or Arabian French people in these areas. We don't have that in Australia. We've done a decent job at integration, not assimilation, but integration, getting everyone on the same page. And the second feather in Australia's cap is that we have so far seen less of the white nationalist backlash than European countries have. We don't have an Alternative for Deutschland. We don't have a Front National. We don't have a Marine Le Pen. We don't have a Nigel Farage. Can we sustain that? I believe it requires a renewed national, maybe global commitment to universalism and a rejection of identitarianism. Multiculturalism's hard. Pluralism is hard. Cosmopolitanism is hard. Liberalism, more broadly, is a difficult balancing act that's under a lot of strain from algorithms, from illiberalism, from bigotry, from fear. And we can't save pluralism and cosmopolitanism, liberalism, just by spouting worthy cliches about how we deplore all kinds of extremism and hate. As long as we talk about society primarily as a collection of communities vying for power and trying to get along, rather than as a collection of human beings who all deserve the benefit of the doubt, it's tricky to understand how you progress. Because our current way of thinking about power struggles, enmity, ancient hatreds is based on a way of looking at society that privileges the group and that subsumes the individual to their group. If most of the activists on Instagram valorize the idea that some groups are collectively responsible for this or that abomination which needs to be rectified or avenged, then how can we say that last night's shooting was a one-off? And that because the assailants are apparently no longer free, we're now safe. We're only as safe as the group who wants to avenge a wrong and sees our group as being guilty of it allows us to be. How safe are any of us in a world of righteous, warring tribes? I don't really like this conclusion because it's a lot more complicated and messy than saying that we should just get more serious about not allowing pro-Palestinian protesters to march across the harbour bridge. It's about reinvigorating what we care about in living in a liberal society in the first place. And maybe it does need immigration reform as part of it. Maybe you do need to be more discerning about bringing in people who don't harbour ancient hatreds. Australia has been spectacularly good at selling the idea that when you come to this country, you come in order to join in with this country. We have not been as ashamed, I don't think, as a country like the United Kingdom has been, in saying, you come here and you leave your shit behind. You don't bring that here. And now a bunch of people were just trying to have a picnic. And it came here. Is there a way of asking a question in such a way that you actually will weed out people who are prone to radicalization? I don't know. The piece that I wrote, which I read out, there's one last bit from David Frum that I wanted to share with you. He writes, among Western liberals, there's a strong impulse to show respect to people from other cultures or who hold other beliefs by interpreting their words and actions in the most benign way. But sometimes the way to show the deepest respect, David writes, is by taking people seriously, believing their words as they're spoken, heeding their own accounts of their intentions. The massacre on Bondi Beach, he writes, is an ultimate consequence of this well-meaning condescension, but there were a lot of stops along the way, and more ahead. As I say, it's terribly sad in Sydney, and it'll take some time for Australians, especially Jewish Australians, to look, I mean, anything I say is going to be trite. What I actually feel is a more prosaic grief than the poetry of where I was going with that sentence. What I actually feel is selfishly sad that the unruffled, carefree nature of Bondi Beach is tarnished, that it will henceforth forever be a place of great tragedy as well as levity, that its sort of symbolic role as the apotheosis of Australian hedonism and beachy freedom we'll always have this dark cloud over it. Yes, this country is carefree and fun, and it's a place where you can go to art fairs and you can go on the Ferris wheel and you can get your fairy floss. That's what we call cotton candy for American listeners. And you can rollerblade around and you can sunbathe. But you're still part of the fucking world. That's the little asterisk that yesterday adds to the future of Bondi Beach. Don't get any illusions, Australia, it says. You might think you're safe. So I ended my piece that I was writing, which I read from initially at the beginning here when I was talking about the role that Bondi Beach plays in the national imagination, or certainly the imagination of my city. And I ended it by saying, the deep, nauseating knot in my chest as I tucked my daughter into bed last night and kissed her on the forehead concerned what it might mean if this atrocity has an ethnic, religious, political, or other identitarian rationale. It is, and of course, subsequently it seems that it has. It is fundamental to the Australian identity that we are a hodgepodge of friendly foreigners who leave our tribal enmities at the door. We come to this country to have a swim and a barbie together, which is exactly what the attendees at Hannukah by the sea were doing. If the terrorists shared the increasingly popular belief that Jews are collectively to blame for some awful stuff, and that fighting back is more virtuous than being civil, then how can I promise my daughter that tonight's atrocity was an aberration? If the wider culture emphasizes that some groups are collectively responsible for this or that abomination which must be avenged, how can I say any of us is safe? I had a wish as I turned off my daughter's light and headed to bed myself last night. My wish, my hope, my hopeless hope, was that I might wake up this morning to learn that the gunmen turned out to be mere random psychopaths. If we could chalk this up to arbitrary bloodlust, then maybe we can retain Australians' faith that we're safe here. All of us, amongst each other. Maybe we'd be able to heal and unify and recover side by side. To splash and swim and stroll and sunbathe again together, carefree, on Bondi's shimmering golden sand. I hope you're well and safe wherever in the world you are. To the Jews out there, happy Hannukah. To everyone else, all my love.